and record the Barnes-Hodges family histories as far as I'm able to recall it. Firstly, I'll deal with the Barnes side of the family. Secondly, with the Hodges side. And thirdly, a 30-year period from 1932 to 1962, when I was growing up at Exmouth, and to the time I was married in Dunedin, New Zealand, on the 25th of August 1962. I'm Anne Annesley Cutler, née Hodges, and I was born in 1923, and I am the granddaughter of the late Edward and Alice Barnes, who used to live at Fernbank, Godalming, Surrey. Godalming is a small market town, about 30 miles southwest of London. It's about 4 miles from Guildford and 9 or 10 miles from Woking, where I was born. The early Barnes family came from Portsmouth. What I record of the Barnes family is that which my mother, Mildred Ethel Hodges, the eldest daughter of the late Edward and Alice Barnes, and her brother, Alan Barnes, told me when they were alive of the early life at Fernbank. I also recall those memories that I have of living at Fernbank from 1925 until 1931, at which time it was sold on the death of Granny Barnes. Before talking about the individual members of the Barnes family, I think it's absolutely essential that we should look at the extended family tree of the Barneses in order that you can see where the individual members of the family fit in. Here is the extended Barnes family tree, and I'll go through it systematically, telling you who the people are on it. First of all, there's Joseph Barnes, my great-great-grandfather. We don't know the name of his wife. His son was Joseph Barnes, and he married Eliza Bidder. Edward Bidder and Mary Ann were Eliza's parents. They had 3 children, as far as I know. Edward, born in 1850, who was my grandfather. Alice, who didn't marry, and Robert. Edward Barnes, my grandfather, married Alice White, and her father was Alfred White. They, in turn, had 6 children. Firstly, in 1881, Alfred Edward Joseph, then my mother, Mildred Ethel, born in 1883. The third child was Frederick Leonard, born in 1885, and he died as a baby. After him came Albert Ernest, born in 1887, and he died when he was about 12 years old of scarlet fever. Dorothy Irene was born in 1891, and finally, Alan Bertram, Uncle Alan. Now, my mother, Mildred Ethel Barnes, married James William Annesley Hodges. And here I am, Anne Annesley, born in 1923. I subsequently married Edmund John Balfour Cutler in New Zealand, and I have one son, Andrew James Annesley Cutler, who was born in 1965. Now, the only other child of Alfred and of Edward and Alice who married was Alan Bertram Barnes, and he married firstly Eva Downing Wills, and their son was Michael Edward. He married Gillian Margaret Martin, and they had 3 children, Emma, Jeremy, and Toby. Emma is now married to Timothy Traynor, and she has two little girls, Charlotte and Georgina. Jeremy was married last year, and his wife is called Camilla Imogen. Now, Uncle Alan subsequently married again because he became divorced from Eva Wills, and he married Laura Mabel Chilcott. They had two daughters, Jennifer Mary and Alison Irene. Jennifer Mary's first husband was Stephen Clark, but she was subsequently divorced from him and then married Colin Bond. They have one son, Christopher. Alison Irene married Stephen Haig, and they have two daughters, Jessica and Rebecca. Now we'll come back to the children of Joseph Barnes and Eliza. We've talked about Edward and Alice White, who were my grandparents. Edward had one sister, Alice, who never married and who I actually knew. Now we come to Robert Barnes, who died in 1911. He married firstly Eliza, who died in 1898, and after her death he remarried, but we don't know the name of his second wife or when he married her. Robert and Eliza had 8 children: Harry, Eliza, who died in 1888, Jimmy, Ada Maud, who died in 1944, Molly, and 3 infants who died very early on in the piece. Harry had 3 children. He married first of all Rose, and after she died he remarried Ivy. Now, the children from the first marriage were Stuart, Betty, and Don. Stuart had a daughter and 2 sons. The daughter was Jill Slater, and I'd met her when we were in England in 1992, and she lives at Budleigh Salterton. Betty had a daughter, Mary Rose, and a son, but I don't know their names. Molly married Captain Micklejohn, Royal Navy, and she had one daughter, Peggy Micklejohn. Now, there is one cousin which I remember my mother talking about, and that was cousin Laura Barnes, and I think that she must have been a cousin of grandfather Barnes. I have one error in the family tree to correct. I accidentally called Jennifer's son Christopher instead of Michael. Now I want to talk about the individual members of the Barnes family and to tell you what I know about them. Firstly will be great-great-grandfather Joseph Barnes, who is at the top of our family tree. Great-great-grandfather Joseph Barnes was probably born in the late 1700s. From the marriage certificate of his son in 1837, in the column recording the rank or profession of the father, it states that Joseph Barnes Sr. was a shipwright. I've not been able to find my great-great-grandmother's name. The marriage certificate of great-great-grandfather Barnes' son, Joseph Barnes Jr., states that he was a painter and glazier. He married Eliza Bidder, whose father was said to be a gunner, Royal Navy. They were married on the 22nd of July, 1837, in the parish of Portsea in the county of Southampton. Now let us go back to the Barnes family tree. Grandfather Joseph Barnes and his wife Eliza had 3 children that I know of: Edward, my grandfather, a sister Alice, and Robert. I will now focus on my grandparents, Edward and Alice Barnes. Edward, aged 30, and Alice White, aged 24, were married at Portsea in the county of Southampton on the 22nd of July 1880, the same day, as a matter of fact, and the same month as Joseph and Eliza had been married in 1837. Joseph's son Edward, who is shown here in his 50s, was married to Alice White on the 22nd of July 1880, which is the same day and month that his father Joseph and his mother Eliza had been married in 1837. Edward's profession on the marriage register was said to be a surgeon-dentist. Interestingly, at the marriage of Joseph, Edward's father, in 1837, he's recorded as being a painter and glazier. But here, at the marriage of Edward in 1880, he is recorded as being a gentleman, and he is now the proud owner of a decorating shop in Portsmouth selling wallpapers and painting material. This is the only good picture I have of Edward Barnes's wife Alice and my grandmother. It was taken about 1929 when she was about 73 years old. The small girl is myself, and the baby is Michael Barnes, my first cousin, and we are posed on the veranda of Fernbank, Godalming. This is Alice Barnes' engagement ring. My mother used to tell me that Alice turned Edward down more than once, but he persisted until she accepted him. I can only get this ring on my little finger. We don't know the name of Alice's mother, but the photo in this locket that Alice used to wear is probably that of her mother. Alice's father was called Alfred, and on the marriage certificate of Edward and Alice, he is said to be a brewer. John Brickwood signed as a witness to the marriage of Edward and Alice. The Brickwood family were long-standing friends of the Barnes family. John became Sir John Brickwood and managing director of Brickwood Breweries in the Portsmouth area. My grandfather's brother, Robert, also became a managing director. Before I begin to talk about Fernbank, I'd like to make a comment about something that puzzles me greatly. I find it quite amazing that neither my mother or Uncle Alan ever talked about their grandparents. There may be several reasons for this. Firstly, in the 1880s and 1890s and the beginning of this century, people didn't travel very much, and perhaps the Barnes children never met their grandparents very often. Secondly, the grandparents may not have been well and were getting on in years. At the marriage of Edward, his father was already about 73 years old, and Alice's mother didn't sign as a witness on her marriage certificate. This may have meant that she was already dead. Then again, children in the time when the Barnes children were growing up were seen and not heard. And maybe Edward and Alice just didn't talk to their children about their grandparents. Then again, my mother and Uncle Alan might have been the culprits, and they just didn't tell Michael and myself what they knew about their grandparents. In any case, we, the Barnes descendants, are the poorer off for this lack of communication. I could kick myself that when my mother was alive, I didn't ask her about her grandparents. But when you're young, life is forever, and you don't think about these things. Alice and Edward Barnes lived at Fernbank, Godalming, Surrey, from the time of their marriage and this was their only home. It was a good-sized family house. There was a passage leading from the front door through the hall to the kitchen. Downstairs it had a dining room which had a folding door which led to grandfather's study. The other front room used to serve as grandfather's dental surgery. A winding staircase led to the first floor where there were 4 main bedrooms and a dressing room. Granny Barnes and Edward, this was their room and this was their dressing room. And this used to be my parents' bedroom when we lived there. I always remember the loo. My mother used to have to lift me up onto the squarish wooden seat when I was a little girl and hold on to me tightly, as otherwise I probably would have fallen in and never been heard of again. It had a lovely blue willow pattern bowl, and the chain had a big china handle on it, on which you flushed the toilet. To the side and rear of the house, set into a brick wall, was a door leading to a cobbled courtyard, and across this courtyard and up some steps was a small cottage with a downstairs room with a coal range in it. You opened a door from this room, and it led straight to a winding wooden staircase up to the upstairs room. I believe that when the Barnes children were growing up, the servants used to live in this cottage. This cottage was just standing empty when I lived at Fernbank. This is my mother and myself when I was about 4. At this side of the house also, there was a lawn and an orchard and a bubbling spring with a pool, which one day my father fell into, actually, when he was showing me a frog on the other side of it. Then, at the bottom of the garden, there was a tennis court and a stream, which divided the Barnes property from that of their neighbours, the Aldens. On the other side of Fernbank, and at its rear, an extension had been built so that it joined onto the cottage. From where Fernbank stood, Oxford Road wound up towards Godalming town. In this watercolour, painted about the turn of the century, it shows at the extreme left one of a pair of cottages. The one not shown, which adjoined the Fernbank extension and of which I've told you, is the one in which the Fernbank servants used to live. The photograph which you see shows Uncle Alan, when he was about 25 years old, standing a little further along Oxford Road after a very heavy snowfall in 1920. The extension, which had been built onto the rear of Fernbank and which joined it to the cottage, was slightly lower than the main house. Downstairs it provided a new side entrance to the house, a small entrance lobby, and to the right of this a large room. I think this room was used as a sort of housekeeper's room, where sewing, mending and ironing was done, as well as it serving as a servant's sitting room. The top floor of the extension had 2 rooms. One used to be the nursery, and the other the nanny's bedroom. When I lived at Fernbank, the nursery had been converted into a bathroom, and the other room was the maid's bedroom. In the early days, when the Barnes family needed a bath, they would have had a bathtub in their respective rooms or in the nursery. When I lived at Fernbank, there were still washstands with marble tops and with bowls to wash in most of the rooms. Before the house was connected to the main water supply, the water was obtained by a pump in the scullery, and I remember this pump was still in working use when I was living at Fernbank. There was a high brick wall with broken glass and iron spikes set into the top of it, to prevent people climbing over into the grounds, and in the wall there was a big solid wooden door with a wrought iron handle that could be locked. Here is a map showing the relationship of Fernbank to the next door neighbours, the Aldens. This is Oxford Road, and here is the big wooden gate. A path led up from this gate to the veranda and front door, and there was a branching path which led to the side door. The lawn sloped down towards the pond, which contained a fountain, watercress and frogs. Fernbank was the last house in Oxford Road, and from the bottom of the front garden the road curved round to go to the next village called Milford. The next door house along this road belonged to the Aldens. They were flour millers, and across the road from their house there was a large lake and the flour mill. My mother used to tell me that this lake gave untold amusement to the Alden and Barnes children when they were growing up. In the summer they would go boating on it, and in the winter, when it froze over, it was used to skate on. It was on this lake that Mr. Sam Alden taught Alan to fish and to shoot, using the waterfowl on the lake as a target. Sometimes my mother, when I was a little girl, used to take me for walks in their woods, especially in the bluebell season. And in later years, the large house at the edge of these woods was converted to the Lake Hotel. At the back of the house, there was a path which led to the stables, tennis court and orchard. When we were in Godalming in 1982, I took a photograph of Fernbank and it looked like this. The house looked well cared for, and it clearly shows the extension to which I referred. However, the old side entrance and windows, both top and bottom, have been blocked up, and the two cottages which adjoined Fernbank have been pulled down. The tall brick wall, which used to go round the property, with its lovely solid wooden gate, have gone, as well as the cedar tree which used to stand here, the conservatory at the end of the veranda, and the pond at the bottom of the garden. A large chunk of garden has been taken away in order to widen the road. I thought it would be interesting for you to see something of Godalming as it is today, in 1992. Firstly, Oxford Road and Fernbank. The shrubs planted in front of the house have grown up. The pepper pot, which stands at the entrance to the High Street, this was the old market building. This street leads to the parish church where Mummy and Daddy were married and I was christened. The parish church. Thank you very much. Leaded lights in an old building of 1663 in the High Street. Was the old market town about 4 miles away, which the Barnes family often went to. This is the High Street. And lastly, the Barnes family grave at Eashing Cemetery, when Andrew and I were there in 1992. Michael and I had the grave renovated in 1983 by a Godalming stonemason, but I see it looks as if it needs another clean, so I'll get this done. Now that I've told you all I know about the old Barnes family home, perhaps you will be better able to imagine the sort of life they led and come to know our ancestors better as I talk about. I never knew my grandfather. The little I know of him was told to me by my mother, Mildred Ethel Barnes, his eldest daughter. The photo that you're looking at is the only photo I have of Grandfather Barnes. Edward was born in 1850, only 13 years after Queen Victoria came to the throne, and he was the son of Joseph and Eliza Barnes, née Bidder, who lived at Portsmouth. He qualified as a surgeon-dentist, but we do not know where he did his training. At the time of his marriage in 1880, his place of residence was stated to be at High Street, Godalming. Presumably, he lived and had his surgery there. After his marriage on the 22nd of July, 1880, he and Alice moved into Fernbank. My mother used to say that he was not a big man and was of slight build. The photograph of him, seated on his favourite Arab horse called Barbara, outside Fernbank, seems to confirm her description of him. Outside his professional life, he used to lead a country gentleman's existence, riding to hounds and keeping game birds for a hobby. Apparently he was a very sociable person with many friends, and he spent much time with his children when they were growing up, teaching them about animals and nature around them. He even provided a donkey for them to ride, and he also made sure that they learnt how to entertain themselves, encouraging them to partake in amateur theatricals and to learn music. Uncle Alan used to say that the Barnes Christmas parties were events not to be missed, and that there were many interchanges of visits between the Barnes family and the families that they knew in the Godalming area. The only memento that I have of Grandfather is his gold propelling pencil with an amethyst in the end of it. This has temporarily been made into a lace bobbin for me. And this pencil was given to Grandfather in lieu of payment of his bill, which he could not pay. My mother was extremely fond of her father. Sadly, this is all I can tell you of Grandfather Barnes. He died of pneumonia in 1911, aged 61, and is buried in the family grave at Oxford Ridge Cemetery in Godalming. Unfortunately, there are no early photographs of Granny Barnes. The one you're going to see was taken when she was about 73 years old. Granny Barnes was 24 years old and 6 years Edward's junior when she married him in 1880. They both came from the same district in Portsmouth. In the first 6 years of her married life, Alice bore 4 of her 6 children. From what my mother told me, she had a nanny and servants to do the housework and cooking, but would have personally supervised the housekeeping and ordering of the food. In those days, the tradesman would have taken orders at the door and delivered these orders to the house. As eldest daughter, my mother said she had to help with the younger children. I don't think Alice was the sort of person who romped with her children. It was their father who they seemed to look to for organising their entertainment. Apparently Alice Barnes was not a person to be trifled with. It was reputedly said that once when she went on a shopping spree in Godalming, when the tradesman gave her back her change, he said to her, "Thanks, love." And she looked him in the eye and said, "Don't be impertinent, young man. You are speaking above your station, and I'll never come into your shop again." And she didn't. It must be remembered that in the late 19th century and the early part of this century, an upper middle class lady speaking in this fashion wouldn't have been unusual, because they thought of tradesmen as no more than servants, and none of Alice Barnes' servants would ever have spoken to her like that. Alice Barnes, I now realise, was quite a tiny lady. She is shown here at my christening party. She wore long frocks with a bone neckline, and she used to wear lorgnettes, and these used to be attached to a cord and tucked into her bodice. The first Christmas following Uncle Alan's wedding, he brought Eva to spend Christmas at Fernbank. It started to snow on Christmas Day, and by Boxing Day morning there was a huge snowfall. My mother must have spread the word among his old friends that he would be spending Christmas at Fernbank, for mid-morning on Boxing Day, suddenly the bottom of the front garden filled up with a crowd of people who had come to see Uncle Alan and his new wife. Here's my father and Uncle Alan. To Granny Barnes, watching from the house, it must have seemed like a replay of the sort of thing that would have happened when her husband was still alive and her children were growing up. Uncle Alan and I tobogganed down the front lawn, and everybody built a huge snowman for my benefit. My mother and Bob the Sealyham dog are seen beside the snowman. This is a photograph of Granny Barnes with myself and Michael taken on the veranda at Fernbank. When I knew Granny Barnes, she was far from well. In fact, this was the reason why my parents had moved back to Fernbank about 1925 from Mayford, where they had been living since their marriage in 1921, so that my mother could look after her mother. In those last years, I wonder how much Granny Barnes talked to my mother about family events of the past. How close were mother and daughter? I wish I knew. When I lived at Fernbank, Granny Barnes lived mainly in her upstairs bed-sitting room. It had a large brass bedstead in it, on which was a feather bed. She used to come down for Sunday midday lunch, I always remember, and I used to be admonished to be a good girl, Anne, because I think she got very tired with the young children. She was bedridden for the last few weeks of her life, and my mother nursed her until she died of bronchitis in 1931, aged 75. Alfred was the eldest of the Barnes children. I don't know anything about his early life, except that Alfred and my mother as children were taken to the doctor's surgery in Godalming and actually had their tonsils removed without anaesthetic, and then walked home. Can you imagine the trauma they must have suffered? It's a wonder if children ever survived. My mother and her elder brother who were so close in age, apparently used to do a lot of things together. My mother used to say that he was very musical and that he played the violin beautifully. My mother was herself an accomplished pianist, gaining her ARAM, and together with Alfred, they were often asked to give recitals and play at special functions. I don't know what he did for a living when he grew up. Alfred joined the Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment and was killed, aged 37, on the 1st of July 1918, only a month before the war ended, which was a tragedy in itself. He was probably caught in the fighting following the Second Battle of the Somme, which took place in March-April 1918 around St Quentin. The British War Cemetery at Bagneux, 1¼ mile southwest of Doullens, where Alfred is buried, is quite close to St Quentin. He is buried in Plot 3, Row G, Grave 2. He is also commemorated on the stone of the family grave at Otford Reef Cemetery, Shackleford Road, Godalming. The British War and Victory Medal and certificate were sent to Granny Barnes in September 1921. It reads, "I am directed to transmit to you the accompanying British War and Victory Medal, which would have been conferred upon Private Barnes, Alfred Edward Joseph, the Queen's Royal Regiment, had he lived, in memory of his services with the British forces during the Great War. In forwarding the decoration, I am commanded by the King to assure you of His Majesty's high appreciation of the services rendered. I am to request that you will be so good as to acknowledge the receipt of the decoration on the attached form. I am your obedient servant," I can't read the signature, "Colonel of Records." I don't know what you think, but to me it's very poor recompense for Alfred's life, for his mother to be sent 3 years after his death a medal which could have been cheaply minted, and a certificate with high-sounding phrases supposed to be sent by order of the King. I find that I feel very sorry for Alfred. With his upbringing, he must have been an intelligent man and probably realised that as an infantryman he was cannon fodder. He lost his life fighting a war I'm sure he hated. He was buried in France, and none of his family ever went to look for his grave. My mother was in France on several occasions, but it never seemed to cross her mind to try and find the war cemetery where her brother, whom she was so fond of, was buried. Perhaps in the 20s, 30s and 40s relatives didn't search for their war dead. I feel that if I didn't live on the other side of the world, I'd like to go and look for Alfred myself. My mother was born in 1883 and was called Mildred Ethel, but she was always known in the family as Millie, except when her kid brother Alan, who was 11 years junior to her and an awful tease, used to call her Mildewed Ethel, or just Mildewed, which made her excessively annoyed. She didn't talk very much about her early childhood, except to say that when they went to visit friends and it was too far for them to walk, they used to go by horse and carriage, and that once, when they went to visit the Bakers at Oxenford Grange, that's Pam's grandparents, it snowed hard and they had to stay the night because it was too treacherous on the roads for the horses. She also used to talk about going to visit Uncle Robert at Portsmouth and what fun they had with their cousins there. In the summer, they used to organise tennis parties, and there were musical activities all through the year, and in the winter time they used to have dances at Fernbank, and with other of their friends in the Godalming area. The photo that you see is the earliest I have of my mother. She was probably in her early 20s. In 1911, when her father died, she was 28 years old and Alan was 17. She'd long wanted to train as a nurse, but her parents weren't keen for their daughter to leave home. In the early 1900s, it was thought unseemly for young ladies to work. When her father died in 1911, she broke free and enrolled as a trainee nurse at St Thomas's Hospital, London, being by far the oldest trainee of her year. The nursing school at St Thomas's was founded by Florence Nightingale. Trained nurses of St Thomas's Hospital could join the Nightingale Fellowship, and this is her badge. She always wore it when she was in uniform. At the beginning of the First World War, she had completed her nursing training, and she joined the Queen Alexandra's nursing service. In about 1916, she became matron of Hilda's Military Hospital at Haslemere, and a selection of photos from this book will show you the extent of her war effort. This is Hilda's, the large house which had been commandeered in Haslemere to be a military hospital. When my mother committed herself to do a job, she would go into it boots and all to make a success of it. Some of the photos that I'm going to show you show her novel approach in those days to convalescence, which today has the grand name of occupational therapy. She believed that by keeping the walking wounded busy, it speeded up their recovery, keeping them from being bored, as well as helping to entertain both bed patients and themselves. Her father's education of teaching the Barnes children to entertain themselves really stood her in good stead. Here is one of the wards at Hilda's, and here is my mother. I loved this one of her in her trendy leather coat. Here she is seen in a posed group with her nurses and soldiers. The occupational therapy side of the pictures. Here she's got the soldiers shelling peas. She got some of them organised into a choir. Then there were the amateur theatricals, with the matron director keeping her eye on things. And here we have a musical act. And here we have the sports activities, a tug of war, nurses versus the soldiers, and my mother in the middle of the line of the tug of war. And here are their opponents, the soldiers. When the hospital closed, her staff presented her with this gold nursing watch. This is the reverse side. Inside the back casing, it's inscribed, "From her many friends at Hilda's."
1917.
In recognition of her nursing services during the war, she was awarded the Royal Red Cross. And I'm going to read you the telegram that came from Buckingham Palace to Matron Mildred Barnes. "Your attendance is required at Buckingham Palace on Wednesday next, the 7th instant, at 10 o'clock a.m. Service dress. Regret that no one except those to be invested can be admitted to the palace. Please telegraph acceptance." Her Royal Red Cross. The official photograph taken immediately after the investiture. my mother became matron of St Nicholas Orthopaedic Hospital for Children at Purford, Surrey, which was a satellite hospital of St Thomas's Hospital, London. Aunt May, my father's younger sister, was married to the Reverend Colin Murdoch, and he was chaplain at St Nicholas Hospital. And here is Uncle Colin. You're looking at James William Annesley Hodges, my father, aged about 35. Aunt May indulged in a spot of matchmaking and invited her brother, my father, down to Purford to stay with them at weekends, and made damn sure that she invited Matron Barnes to meet him on these visits. Aunt May's efforts paid off, and Mildred Barnes and William Hodges became engaged and then married in 1921. I've had my mother's engagement ring and the diamond from a solitaire diamond gold brooch which Aunt Alice bequeathed to her when she died, made into a small brooch which I often wear. I'm wearing my father's wedding present to my mother, which was an aquamarine and pearl pendant set in gold and platinum with a dear little platinum chain. It was made by Mappin and Webbs of London, and I think it's an Art Nouveau design. And I think it's as fresh and modern today as the day he gave it to her over 70 years ago. I'm pretty sure my mother told me that this photograph was taken on their wedding day. They were married in Godalming Parish Church at 8 a.m. on 26th of March 1921. Obviously the early hour was necessary so that they could have the wedding breakfast and then travel to Bournemouth for their honeymoon, and to get there before dark about 4:30 p.m. My mother continued as matron of St Nicholas Hospital, Purford, until she had to resign because of my imminent arrival. On her departure, she was presented with this grandfather clock, which now stands in our hall. Presented to Mrs. Hodges by the St Nicholas Home Committee as a token of appreciation for her services, April 1923. My christening party took place in the dining room at Fern Bank, and the pictures that we're going to show you are interesting in many ways. The people at my christening were Mrs. Alden and Margaret Alden, the next door neighbours of the Barnes, Granny Barnes, my godmother, Dorothy, my mother's youngest sister, my father, my mother, and myself. Close-up of the Hodges family. In this picture, the original painting of Fern Bank can be seen, which I've been using earlier on in this history of the family. It also shows some of the Barnes family silver. Here was a silver cake plate, there was a silver tea service, silver water jug. Unfortunately, all this silver has been dispersed. I'm really sad and annoyed that this has happened through no fault of my own. I'm showing here a photo of Mr. Sam Alden because you've seen his wife and daughter at my christening. Here is a small photo of Bessie Alden nearly out of the picture. My parents' first home was a bungalow at Mayford, not far from Woking. It was when she was living here that my mother used to do some district nursing. My father was away for about 11 hours each weekday, and after being a career woman for the last 12 years, she probably found that time dragged with only me to look after. So she found a nanny to look after me when she was visiting patients, bought a motorbike, learned to ride it, and started on her rounds. Quite something for a woman to do in the 1920s. My father used to have a wonderful photo of her dressed in a leather coat, seated on this large motorbike, but this treasure of a photo has been lost. Two photos taken in the Mayford days, one when I was about 6 months old, the other a doll's tea party taken when I was about 18 months old. In about 1926, my parents moved from Mayford to Woking so that my father didn't have so far to travel each day to London. He worked in a public health institute in London and travelled up and down to London 6 days a week. In 1927, Dorothy, who must have been living with Granny Barnes at Fernbank, died. Now, my parents, who had only just moved to Woking, thought that they would then have to sell up and go and live with Granny Barnes. She was 71 and in indifferent health, and they found that this was the only way around the problem. It must have been quite a difficult decision to make. Godalming was even further away from London than Mayford, their first home had been, and the extra travelling time made my father's working day even longer than ever. He'd leave about 7:30 a.m. in the morning to walk a mile to the station to catch the 8 a.m. train to London, and sometimes wouldn't get home till 6:30 or 7 at night. In fact, one day he was so tired that he fell asleep in the train and missed the Godalming stop, and the next stop was Portsmouth, where he had to wait for the train to take him back and didn't get home till nearly midnight. I calculate that my father had to walk up to 20 miles a week to and from stations in all weathers. What an awful chore his daily work must have been for him. The more I researched this history, the more I admire the things that my parents did in the past and went over my head at the time. I reckon they must have made a terrific contribution to Granny Barnes' well-being. I wonder if she realised it. The first car, I remember, was bought shortly before Fernbank was sold. It was second-hand and was covered in a maroon fabric material. You had to be extremely careful not to knock the bodywork, as the material used to tear. There were no springs in the seats. You blew them up in a similar way to blowing up a lilo. In 1931, this car was then updated to a new baby Austin, which cost £100. In the late 1920s, just before my parents bought the small Austin car that you've just seen, my mother decided that she'd like to learn to drive. At this stage, they had a second-hand, bullet-nosed Austin Cowley touring car, which had an outside dicky seat. My father asked the local garage proprietor if he would teach my mother to drive, and he agreed. So they went out on the first lesson with my father sitting in the back seat. Well, everything went swimmingly for a little while, but then my father observed that my mother was steering very erratically and was actually heading straight for a hedge, which abutted onto a railway bridge. Well, he thought quickly, and he thought it was no place for him, so he jumped out and landed on the side of the road. My mother went happily on into the hedge and landed up with the front left-hand wheel spinning in thin air over the railway line. She managed to scramble out of the driver's seat and said in the same time, "Where's my dear husband?" And there he was a few yards back, sitting on the side of the road with grazed knees and hands and two large holes in his trousers. Apparently what had happened was that my mother was so keen to get the gear change right that she'd completely forgotten to steer the car. Anyway, she got such a fright that she never ever drove again. But my father always enjoyed telling this tale. From 1926, for the next 4 to 5 years, my mother led a normal family life, looking after her husband and myself as a small child, and also Granny Barnes. In her spare time, she enjoyed hobbies such as needlework, gardening and music. Here she is at the age of about 43 in 1926. There used to be trips to the sea at Bognor or elsewhere on the south coast, and here my mother and father are fooling about on the beach there. Uncle Alan with Michael and Eva came to stay at Fernbank, and we went for a picnic while they were there. In this photograph, here's my mother, Margaret Alden, Eva, Michael, Uncle Alan, myself with my new school hat on, and my father. This group was taken at the same time when they were staying, when we went on this picnic I've just showed you. I think this is probably the last photograph of Granny Barnes. Here she is, Michael, Eva, my mother, and myself, and the standard car that Uncle Alan had bought. And then in 1931, Granny Barnes died, and Fernbank had to be sold. When in England last year and staying with Laura at Exeter, I went through Uncle Alan's old photograph album, and I found the following 2 photographs in it, and I think they must be inserted in the history at this stage. Here, Michael and I are standing beside Granny Barnes' grave soon after her funeral in March 1931. I'd be about 7.5 and Michael just over 2. The second photograph was taken on the 13th of May 1931, less than 3 months after Granny Barnes' death, at the sale of the effects of Fernbank. I really loathe this photograph, with furniture and carpets hauled out onto the lawn and a crowd of people milling about on the veranda, intruding into what was so recently the family home. I should be dressed in mourning for the next few minutes while I'm talking to you, while I tell of the saddest part of the Barnes history. In 1931, Granny Barnes died, and Fernbank and its contents had to be sold. Here is the catalogue. The auctioneers were W&G Enticknap of Godalming. I don't know how much the house sold for, but the entire contents fetched only £216. The year was 1931, in the middle of the Great Depression, and a terrible time to have to sell up. However much my mother and Uncle Alan would have liked to buy some of the effects, I think it was probably beyond their means to have done so at that time. Both had small children to support, and they had to buy houses to live in. I'll read you a few examples of the prices paid for some of the effects. A 30-piece Copeland dinner service, £1.08. A 3-foot 9-inch mahogany dining table extending to 6 feet, £3. An 8-day grandfather clock in mahogany case, £6.10. A case of 6 silver apostle spoons and pair of tongs, 7 shillings. And so it goes on. It makes me weep to think of the prices paid for these effects, which was almost tantamount to giving them away. My mother did have a bid for a few articles. She bought Where the Streamlet Curves by Waller and paid £1.12 6 for it. Uncle Alan also bought a silver cream jug, which was an antique weighing 7 ounces for £4.5. The remaining silver furniture, paintings and engravings were sold to the highest bidder. So the possessions of Edward and Alice Barnes, gathered over 50 years of life at Fernbank, were dispersed in an afternoon to the highest bidder in all directions, like a mortally wounded person bleeding to death. I guess this sort of thing has happened to many families, but I think it's so sad that we, the descendants, have missed out on so much of our heritage. With the sale of Fernbank, a new chapter in my mother's life began. In fact, the next few years would probably be the most rewarding of her whole life. My mother had a dream to start her own nursing home. At this time, Uncle Alan was an estate agent at Exmouth in Devon, and she probably asked him to keep his eye out to see if any such institution ever came on the market. After the sale of Fernbank, we went back to Woking to live, but within the year, Uncle Alan had found exactly what she wanted. A 20-bed nursing home with a modern operating theatre for surgical patients and a maternity unit. In 1932, we moved to Exmouth, and she became matron and joint owner with my father of the Exmouth Nursing Home, Pencarrick, Exmouth. Although she was the figurehead in command of the nursing home, she wouldn't have been able to run it so successfully if it hadn't been for my father, who looked after all the business side of the undertaking. Surgeons used to come down from Exeter to operate, and with its well-oiled running procedure and its prime position with beautiful views across the sea to the Haldon Hills and Torquay, it fulfilled the need of the private patient very effectively. Pencarrick itself was only about 100 yards from the sea. This picture, painted by Uncle Alan, shows the views that were obtained from Pencarrick. The fees for nursing were 7 guineas a week for a room with a view, and 6 guineas for a garden room. This included all nursing fees. As well as my mother, the staff included 4 fully trained nurses and 3 probationers, a cook, housekeeper, 3 maids, and a gardener. Now, here we have the seafront of Exmouth, the River Exe estuary, and the Haldon Hills, and Torquay was a bit further round. About 1936, my parents extended their coverage of nursing facilities for the area. They bought a big house nearby called Longford, and here they housed about 12 trained nurses to form a nurses' agency. This service allowed doctors to request nurses for patients to be nursed at home, if they so desired, or other nursing homes in Devon could request our nurses to complement their staff if they were busy. When not employed elsewhere, these nurses used to be at Pencarrick itself. Our trained nurses at Pencarrick also went out to do district nursing care in the area. Also about 1936, my father's mother, Granny Hodges, came to live with us. 88 Clifton Hill in London had become too much for her. She died in 1943, shortly before Pencarrick was closed during the war. I'll now show you some photos taken during those Pencarrick days. Here is my father wearing +4 trousers, which he dearly loved. Some of the nurses. My mother and Michael, and my dog Nipper. My father outside the nursing home with his flying standard car. We had a hut on the beach, and here we are having a family party. There's my mother, my father, Aunt Jane, my father's eldest sister, her husband, Uncle Bert, Granny Hodges, Flo, Norman's fiancée, and myself. And sometime later, here's Norman with his new wife, Flo. We had some lovely holidays in the 1930s. My parents enjoyed travelling, and they used to take me along too. We had 2 Mediterranean cruises. My mother and myself bargaining for poufs in Casablanca. In 1937, we went on a round tour of Germany, and even then there were signs of a potential war with swastikas and photographs of Hitler everywhere, and we were even spat on when we were in Cologne. Here's my mother and father. Pan came with us, and here am I. Before the war, you didn't dash off on your own touring Germany, you had to go with a group. It was very interesting to have seen Berlin pre-war, the Reichstag, and Berchtesgaden. And then in 1939, the Second World War broke out. My mother became a commandant in the St. John's Brigade. Here's my mother in the uniform of a commandant of the St. John's Ambulance Brigade. She helped to train their nurses to man the ambulances during air raid emergencies. By 1943, I'd been in the Wrens for 2 years, and the windows in Pencarrick had been blown out twice by bombs which had been dropped by German bombers over Exmouth. Its vulnerable position on the seafront made it an insecure place to be when you were ill. So patient numbers dropped, and together with food rationing and the manner in which the nurses had gone into the forces during the war, my parents decided that they had better close Pencarrick up. So they did just this. They walked out and closed the doors, after first having an auction to sell off the furniture and other effects. My parents then rented a house called Lane's End at Littleham Cross, Exmouth, not far away from where Uncle Alan lived, and Pencarrick remained empty for nearly 3 years. After I was demobbed in 1945, it was decided that my parents would reopen Pencarrick and make it into a going concern in order to get their capital out of it. A huge undertaking at their age of 65 and 62 years respectively. At the end of the war, everything was difficult to do. For building work, there were permits galore. Furniture had to be got second-hand by going to sales. Food rationing was still in force. But what was more difficult was that by 1948, the National Health Service had been brought in, and this spelt the death knell for private nursing homes. So my parents decided that the only thing they could do was to make Pencarrick into a family-type hotel. And this is what they did. In 1946, the hotel opened, staff were engaged, and the first guests arrived. I worked as part of the team, and we built it into a successful venture. Also in 1946, my parents celebrated their silver wedding, and my father gave my mother this beautiful brooch. This brooch came from Bruford's of Exeter, and it's set with diamonds, rubies and emeralds. It was said to come from a necklace owned by an Indian Maharaja, and Bruford split it up to make 4 brooches. In 1948, the hotel was sold as a going concern, and my parents retired with a good nest egg. My mother spent the last years of her life at number 2 Fairfield Close. This is a photograph of number 2 Fairfield Close. My mother only really had 3 years of retired life before her health started to deteriorate. When she had caught scarlet fever from Bertie in 1899, it hadn't done her heart any good, and in 1951 she had a coronary when on holiday in Rome. My father stayed with her till she was well enough to travel home. In the year following this attack, she had to lead a much restricted life, and during that year she had another attack. My mother is seen here about 6 months before she died. And then on June the 8th, 1953, in Coronation Week, she had another coronary and died before I could get home from London. She was 70 years old. Littleham Church near Exmouth, where my mother's funeral service was held. The ashes of my mother are buried in the same grave as Granny Hodges at Littleham Churchyard, Exmouth. Here is the best photograph that I have of my mother, taken when she was seated on the sea wall at Sidmouth when she was about 65 years old. She had a vibrant personality and a good sense of humour, but she didn't suffer fools gladly. You can say that she was a professional career woman of the 1920s and 30s with great drive and initiative, which wasn't a usual person to be in those years. She has been dead now for nearly 40 years, but my memory of her is as vivid today as on the day that I said goodbye to her on the platform at St. David Station, Exeter, for the last time. My one big regret is that she didn't live long enough to meet Edmund and Andrew. Family tree again, to refresh your memories as to where I have reached in the family history. Look, here's Mildred Ethel Barnes, whose life I've just finished, and logically I should now talk about myself as the daughter of William Hodges and Mildred Ethel Hodges, but I'm not going to do so because I want to finish the Barnes family history first. I'm now going to go on to the life of Frederick Leonard Barnes, the third of the Barnes children. Frederick Leonard, the third of the Barnes children, known to the family as Leonard, died within a year of his birth. The only memento we have of Leonard is a lock of his hair, mounted in a locket which Granny Barnes used to wear as a reminder of her small son. Leonard died as a baby because an incompetent nanny dropped him. There's absolutely nothing that I can tell you of Bertie, except that he died from scarlet fever at the age of 12 or 13 years. There are no photographs at all. We don't even know where Leonard and Bertie are buried, as they don't appear on the stone of the family grave. But presumably they must be buried in the same cemetery as the family grave at Oxford Ridge, Godalming. two photographs of Dorothy Irene, known to the family as Dolly. She probably would be in her teens in this photograph. I think she's got a simply lovely face. My mother told me that she was a very good artist, but other than this, I know nothing more of her. Here she's seen when she's older and presumably living at Fernbank looking after her mother. She died in 1927 of a kidney disease, and I can just remember when this happened. I think it's such a shame that Dolly never married. She could have been one of the many women of her generation who was affected by the First World War, in that thousands upon thousands of men of marriageable age were killed between 1914 and 1918. I would now like to revert back to the life of Granny Barnes for a little while. No wonder the rather remote lady that I knew as Granny Barnes was not bubbling over with joie de vivre. I realise now that she'd had a lot of sadness to contend with in her life. By 1911 she was a widow and had lost two of her children, one as a baby and the other when he was about 12 years old. Now, in 1927, at the age of 71, two more of her children were dead. Alfred, killed in the First World War, and Dorothy, of natural causes, at the age of 37. She had been a widow for 16 years, and now her son Alan was married and lived about 200 miles away, and she was lucky if she saw him for more than a few days a year. In fact, in 1927, my mother was the only one left of her family who was near her. Now that I'm older and I've been researching the Barnes family history, I feel that I can now know Granny Barnes a lot better than at any other time of my life. When in England last year and staying with Laura at Exeter, I went through Uncle Alan's old photograph album, and I found the following two photographs in it, and I think they must be inserted in the history at this stage. Here, Michael and I are standing beside Granny Barnes' grave soon after her funeral in March 1931. I'd be about 7.5 and Michael just over 2. The second photograph was taken on the 13th of May 1931, less than 3 months after Granny Barnes' death, at the sale of the effects of Fernbank. I really loathe this photograph, with furniture and carpets hauled out onto the lawn and a crowd of people milling about on the veranda, intruding into what was so recently the family home. Alan Barnes was the youngest child of Edward and Alice Barnes, and he was 10 years younger than my mother. The first picture that we have of him is of him sitting on the family donkey. And the other photo is of Alan sitting on grandfather's mare Barbara. I found these two old photos in the collection of Laura at Glenmore Road in Exeter. From then on, there are no more photographs of Alan until he reaches his early 20s. Alan was educated at Godalming Grammar School, and his lifelong friend was Clary Ballard. The only photo that I have of Clary Ballard was when he was grown up. Here he is seen with my mother and his first wife, Anne, in about 1928. Alan and Clary used to have barrel races across the stream at the bottom of the garden, and Alan used to walk across this stream on his stilts, knowing the exact location of the soft sand. One day, Clary arrived to say goodbye before going back to boarding school, dressed in his best school uniform. Alan dared him to put on stilts and walk across the stream, showing him how it could so easily be done. Naturally, Clary couldn't resist the challenge, and after putting on the stilts, he walked into the stream. The result was, of course, exactly what Alan had hoped would happen, i.e., Clary struck a soft patch of sand and slowly sank into it, tipping off his stilts and going into the stream. When they both appeared back at the house, there was a big rumpus, and Alan got a spanking, and Clary and his clothes had to be dried out before his mother could take him back to school at Cranley. Another instance of Alan's boyhood days was the story my mother used to tell of how he used to spy on Arthur Mellish, their next-door neighbour, and herself, when they were whispering sweet nothings to each other over the hedge which separated the Fernbank tennis court from the Mellish property. He'd hide behind a bush and listen to everything they said, and then taunt her with it, sometime at some future date. Arthur Mellish still lived in Oxford Road with his 3 sisters when we actually lived there. And they were called then the 3 Black Beetles because they were all dressed in black and used to go around together. I wonder if Arthur was suffering from unrequited love at that stage because he never married. And my mother said he was mad on her, but she really never went for him. Alan also used to talk about the wonderful holidays he used to have at Portsmouth with his cousins. That's his Uncle Robert's children, and how impressed he was when he was met at the station with the coachman in livery and was driven back to the family residence in the Barnes family coach. When Alan left school, he became a pupil of Arthur Wells at Chewsby Farm to learn farming, and he stayed there until he had to join the army, the 16th Hampshire Regiment, in 1916. He was with the army for 7 months, but then he was invalided out because he got pleurisy. He went back to the farm at Chewsley, and he stayed there until 1921. But the hard weather conditions began to affect his health, and he had to give up the idea of farming as a career. He then joined Baverstock and Sons, auctioneers of Godalming, to learn land valuation, and he stayed with them until he went down to Exmouth in 1927. Alan, as a young man, used to love to go hunting and fishing, and he was a keen ornithologist. Here's Alan fishing in his younger days near Godalming. Alan was also a keen amateur artist, and he took lessons from a local artist, A.H. Waller. He also painted miniatures of animals, and 2 of these were submitted to the Royal Academy in London. And here you're seeing the 2 pictures that were submitted. Alan used to enjoy anything to do with the outdoors, and at one time he owned a belt-driven motorcycle, and he used to take part in motor rallies. In 1926, he and Clary Ballard went for a holiday down to Exmouth, and they drove down there in an ABC car. It was whilst on this holiday that he met Eva Wills, who he later married the next year in 1927. In about 1926, Alan came to visit us at the bungalow at Mayford. I would have been about 3 at the time. He must have been told to amuse me, because he picked up some beads of my mother's and put them in his mouth and pretended to swallow them. Well, this impressed me so much that from then on, I always used to call him Uncle Bede. Alan and Eva were married at Holy Trinity Church, Exmouth, and I think they lived at number 1 The Beacon at first, where Eva and her Aunt Emma ran a family-type hotel. When this was sold, they moved to Bellevue Road and lived there for a short time before moving to Iscar Road near Littleham Cross, Exmouth. Michael was born in 1929 at Bellevue Road. Here are 1 or 2 early photographs of Alan and Michael. Michael, when he was about 4, when they went skating, when the pond froze over, and I think this was one of the Richards sisters. And Michael out riding. Doesn't this remind you of Alan astride his father's horse in front of Fern Bank? By the early 30s, they moved again, this time to number 12 The Beacon, a Georgian house with lovely views across the Ex-estuary. Eva's Uncle Harry, for some reason known as Uncle R, used to occupy the top part of this house, and her Aunt Emma also had a room there. I remember going there quite often because it was only a short way away from where we lived. At this stage, Uncle Alan invested in a very trendy Crossley motor car. I don't think he could actually afford it, but nevertheless he enjoyed it very much. The next main event that happened was that he bought the Broadway garage at Littleham Cross, Exmouth. They lived in the house and he rented out the garage. This photograph was taken in the garden at the Broadway garage. Here's my father, Eva, my mother, Michael and Aunt Emma. Soon after going to the Broadway, Alan bought some land behind the Broadway property and had 2 hard tennis courts laid there and founded the Broadway Tennis Club. This was a very successful venture, and it went on very well until the war, when the membership was upset and it had to close. I spent some wonderfully happy hours there playing tennis. During the war, Alan was in the Home Guard, and he and my father used to go out on patrol together at night along the cliffs near Sandy Bay. I haven't got a picture of Alan in Home Guard uniform, but this is one of my father in the uniform. At this time, invasion of the coast by the Germans was a very real threat. I'm sure Daddy hardly knew how to fire a gun. Alan certainly could. But on the whole, they were a pretty unlikely pair to be some of the front-line defenders of Exmouth. In 1943, Blackmore and Sons closed, and Alan went to work for Mudge and Baxter of Exeter. This picture was taken in the mid-1940s. Then, in 1948, Alan divorced Eva as she became attached to another man. At about this time, Alan used to paint on glass, and the tankards he painted he used to sell through a shop in Exeter. These are 2 tankards that he gave to Mummy and myself. Here are the close-ups of them. All through his life he kept up his love of fishing, hunting and painting, and he also liked photography and stamp collecting. In fact, he kept me in touch with the family through photographs that he sent me that he'd taken on special occasions. This photograph was taken by Alan at 6 a.m. in the morning when he was out cub hunting with the East Detton foxhounds in 1949. The second picture shows Alan fishing at Exwick with his great friend Dr. Keith Gladstone. They shared a stretch of salmon fishing on the River Ex. About 1950, Alan married Laura Chilcott, and it was in the early 1950s that he went out on his own in business and bought the estate agency of Hart and Bray in Exeter, and he remained in this business until he retired. In this next photograph, it shows Laura and Alan's young family at the christening tea for Alison at number 2 Fairfield Close, Exmouth. Michael and I were godparents, and I am sitting next to my father. Alan was always ready to have fun with young people, and he was a very good mimic. Over the years, Alan painted his own Christmas cards, and we always looked forward to receiving them. Here are a few that we received. My favourite robin. This card is my favourite and was painted in 1979, 2 years before Bede died. Alan was never happier than when he was with his family. Michael had married Jill Martin about 1960, and a few years later, this photograph was taken by Laura of the 3 generations of the Barnes family. Michael moved from their first home, Charnwood in Barnstaple, to Rose Hill, and Alan painted the house for him. Here is a good picture of Alan and Laura taken a few years later at Jennifer's wedding. In 1971, my brother and sister-in-law visited Alan when on holiday in England, and here they are in the garden of Glenmore Road. Here's Kevin Cutler and Nora Cutler. We came to England in 1972, and we had a lovely family gathering at Rose Hill just before Christmas. We stayed with Uncle Alan and Laura at Glenmore Road. Andrew was about 6.5 years old, and this was the last time that I actually saw Uncle Bede. This picture was taken in November 1980, and it was the last picture taken before he died. Alan died in 1981, a year before we came to England again. He was always very good to me, and I have very fond memories of him. His ashes are scattered in the Garden of Rest at Countess Ware Crematorium, very near to where my father's ashes were scattered also. He lived to see all his children married and knew Michael's 3 children. Unfortunately, he never knew Jennifer's Michael or Alison's Jessica and Rebecca. I'm now going to revert back to the generation of my grandfather, Edward Barnes, and talk about his sister, Alice Barnes, and his brother, Robert, and his family. But first we'll have another look at the family tree to refresh your memories. Now I'm going back to the generation of Edward Barnes, and I'm going to talk about Alice Barnes, his sister, and Robert Barnes, his brother, and his children. Auntie Alice never married. She was the sister of my grandfather and my great aunt. In her early life, my mother said she was full of fun and a very attractive person. She had a small income of her own, and until the Second World War, she used to winter abroad in the south of France. When she had returned to England in 1939, she would have been in her 70s. And she used to stay with various members of the Barnes family until the time came when she had to move on to another relative because she invariably outstayed her welcome due to her living the life of a semi-invalid and being excessively fussy. I first remember Auntie Alice when she came to stay with my mother in Woking in about 1927 when I was about 4 years old. On this occasion, I blotted my copybook completely by creeping up behind her when she was going upstairs and sticking a hat pin into her posterior. Well, as you can imagine, I was never one of her favourites after this. She lived with us in Exmouth for a good time at the beginning of the war, but then she returned to the Portsmouth area from where she had originated. Aunt Alice was a magnificent needlewoman. She embroidered this very fine monogram on a handkerchief for my mother, and then she did this very, very fine hem stitching around the edge of the handkerchief all by hand. One of the things that used to fascinate me that she used to bring back from France were these paper pencils. You sharpened them by putting a penknife under this small sort of circle here, and then you then just peeled off that portion and it sharpened the pencil for you. Aunt Alice was extremely well read, and she was an absolute taskmaster at crossword puzzles. Auntie Alice died of dropsy in a nursing home at Portsmouth about 1944. I sometimes used to go and see her when I was stationed in Portsmouth in the Wrens. She only ever lasted a few weeks at any nursing home because she was so demanding. I don't think she ever appreciated the time and effort I put into going to see her, but she was very, very old at the time and very alone, so I used to go anyway. Now we come to Robert Barnes, who died in 1911. He married firstly Eliza, who died in 1898, and after her death he remarried, but we don't know the name of his second wife or when he married her. Robert and Eliza had 8 children: Harry, Eliza, who died in 1888, Jimmy, Ada Maud, who died in 1944, Molly, and 3 infants who died very early on in the piece. Harry had 3 children, He married first of all Rose, and after she died he remarried Ivy. Now, the children from the first marriage were Stuart, Betty, and Don. Stuart had a daughter and two sons. The daughter was Jill Slater, and I'd met her when we were in England in 1992, and she lives at Dudley Salterton. Betty had a daughter, Mary Rose, and a son, but I don't know their names. Molly married Captain Micklejohn, Royal Navy, and she had one daughter, Peggy Micklejohn. Now, there is one cousin which I remember my mother talking about, and that was cousin Laura Burns, and I think that she must have been a cousin of grandfather Burns. Since making the family history in 1991, I've been to England and found that Robert had 8 children instead of the 3 that I originally knew of. So I've rewritten his portion of the family history, and here it is. Prior to the summer of 1992, I knew very little about Robert Burns and his family, but I made a point of visiting Portsmouth and Southsea for 3 days when we were in England to try and find out as much as I could about them. I had previously written to the Lord Mayor of Portsmouth and the City Records Office, and they were most helpful to me. Robert was the son of Joseph and Eliza Burns, and he was the elder brother of Edward Burns, my grandfather. He owned a paint and decorating shop in Commercial Road, Portsmouth, which still exists today under the name of Burns and Seeger. He married Eliza and had 8 children. Michael and I think this is a photo of Eliza, Robert's wife, as a young woman. The photograph was with Peggy Micklejohn's effects, and it has mother written on the back of it, and then grandmother alongside in Peggy's writing. So this lady must be Molly's mother, or the mother of Peggy's father. Molly, of course, was the daughter of a Robert and Eliza. Here is a photograph of Eliza in later years. Their 8 children were Harry, Jimmy, Eliza, who died aged 18, Ada Maud, who died aged 66 in 1944, and Molly, who married Captain Micklejohn and was the mother of Peggy Micklejohn. 3 of his children died as infants. Eliza, his wife, died aged 52 in 1898, and he subsequently remarried, but there's no mention of when this took place or of the second wife's name. He lived originally at Somerset Villa, Havelock Park. We went there, but the area has been redeveloped, and the site where Somerset Villa would have been is now 20 Outram Road. It was a corner site, and this block of houses has been built there. Number 19 Outram Road remains, and so it is likely that Uncle Robert's house, Somerset Villa, would have been a larger version of number 19. In later years, he moved to 19 St Helens Parade, Southsea, opposite the boating lake and almost on the seafront. Robert became Mayor of Portsmouth in 1892, soon after the new Guildhall was opened. Here is a panel in the council chamber recording the names of the mayors of Portsmouth, And here is Robert's name. Robert was a director of Brickwood's breweries and a lifelong friend of Sir John Brickwood. He was a JP, a governor of Portsmouth Grammar School, and a prominent Freemason. It is said that he missed out on a knighthood because he insulted the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII. I'd love to know what he said. Robert died in 1911 of bronchitis, aged 65, 1 month before his younger brother Edward, my grandfather. Robert owned a lot of property in the South Sea area and left £32,000, which in today's terms would make him a rich man. Robert used to keep a carriage and horses, and because of his position, used to entertain extensively. Robert is buried at Highland Road Cemetery, Southsea, and the stone not only commemorates him, but also his wife Eliza, their eldest daughter Eliza, who died aged 18, 3 of his children who died as infants, and to my great joy, Ada Maud, who died in 1944, and who I can remember meeting. Here is a close-up of one side of the memorial. There are 3 commemorations on the back of the memorial. At the top, Eliza, who died when she was 18. Beneath Eliza is the commemoration to Ada Maud, and on the plinth is the commemoration to the 3 children who died in infancy. Harry, Robert's eldest son, went into the family's paint and decorating business. After his first wife, Rose, died, he remarried Ivy, his secretary, and this had the effect of splitting up the family because they thought he had married beneath himself. When I went to visit Harry's granddaughter, Jill Slater, in Budley Salterton, she told me of these happenings. Harry had 3 children, Stuart, Betty, and Don. Jill Slater is the daughter of Stuart, but Stuart and Don are now both dead. Jimmy Barnes, son of Uncle Robert. He became a solicitor, and rumour had it that his operations as a lawyer were not always above board. I'll now talk about Ada Maud Barnes, daughter of Robert Barnes. As I said previously, she and her sister used to lead a very social life when they were young women. As Portsmouth was a very big naval base, Uncle Robert used to entertain the Navy quite often. And at this time, she met and became engaged to a young naval officer called Micklejohn. How or over what time period I don't know, but her sister managed to lure Captain Micklejohn away from Ada Maud and married him herself. I cannot tell you anything more about Ada Maud until the 1930s at Exmouth, when my mother would suddenly say, "Ada Maud, who winters in the south of France, is coming to see us this afternoon." And Ada Maud would duly turn up wearing her auburn wig and rather theatrical tight clothes. A slight air of mystique emanated from her, and her manner was one of rather forced gaiety. As suddenly as she had arrived, she would then disappear again, until at some future date she decided to look us up again. When the Second World War broke out, Ada Maud had to return to England to live permanently. At first, I think she was in the Portsmouth area, but then she came to Exeter and took a room in a boarding house in St David's Hill, Exeter. She was always very independent, and she never landed on her relatives for hospitality, as her Aunt Alice sometimes did. And then, in 1941, my mother suddenly had a phone call from the Sidmouth police to go and identify a body which had been found on the beach at the bottom of the cliffs there. It was Ada Maud. I think it's so sad that a person who had been so sociable in her early life could no longer stand the loneliness of her existence. Or was it that the air raids on Exeter terrified her? Or was there some other reason that made her take her own life? I think Ada Maud was one of the most colourful characters in the Barnes family, and she commands my great respect. She never moaned about her life or asked favours of other members of the family, and she was always interesting and outwardly cheerful. I wish I'd known her better. I said a little further back when speaking of Robert's elder daughter, mother of Peggy Micklejohn and sister of Ada, that I didn't know her name. But since I've been to England, I've found out that her name was Molly. And again, I forgot to say when talking about Harry Barnes, that when I was in the Wrens in Portsmouth in 1945, I went to see him and his second wife, Ivy. And at this stage, he was quite an old man. And lastly, there's another point I have to clear up. I said that Ada Maud died in 1941, but in actual fact, she died in 1944. I also found out that she took her life because she thought she had throat cancer. How sad, because at the autopsy it was found that this was not the case. Ada Maud's sister, who married Captain Micklejohn, she lived to be over 90 years old, and she died in the 1970s, I think. She was the mother of Peggy Micklejohn. Peggy used to say that she had a miserable childhood due to the fact that they were always moving house in order to keep up with Captain Micklejohn, who was in the Royal Navy. She didn't get on with her mother anyway. Peggy Micklejohn became a teacher of speech and drama. And when I first knew her, she was a newsreader for the BBC. She was a very attractive person then, with lovely curly hair. After the war, she went to live in Brighton and continued her teaching of speech. And I last saw her just before I came to New Zealand the first time in 1959. I continued to correspond with Peggy over the years, but gradually it became apparent that she was getting odder and odder, until in the end she was a virtual recluse. She died about 5 years ago, and she was well in her 80s then. The last person that I have to talk about is Cousin Laura. Now, I think she must have been a cousin of my grandfather. She was a governess, and at the time of the French Revolution in 1870, she was disguised and smuggled out of France in a cart. Michael has a lovely little bone manicure set which belonged to her, and I can remember when I was about 5, my mother talking about her, and we went to visit her grave, which was near Godalming. The following video clips, which are interesting for family history, were taken in Portsmouth last year when I was researching Robert and his family. This is the Guildhall. Here is the corridor in the Guildhall, which houses all the Portsmouth civic silver. Here we see the mace, which would have been carried in procession before Uncle Robert. Here we see the lovely stained glass window in the Guildhall near to the Mayor's Parlour. This is the crest of Portsmouth. We were allowed to go into the Mayor and Mayoress's parlours. This is the Mayor's Parlour. The Guildhall was gutted by fire during World War II, but it has been rebuilt to be as near as possible the same as the original. This is the Mayoress's Parlour. Adjacent to the Guildhall is this street, which leads to the Theatre Royal. Uncle Robert probably went to the Theatre Royal on many occasions. In his later years, Uncle Robert moved to 19 St Helens Parade, Southsea. And this is the house just behind the lamp stand. It was empty when we were there. And the front door is to the left of the big bay windows, and you can't see it. Here's a general view of St Helens Parade. And across the road is the boating lake, and in front of that the seafront. Finally, we visited the grave of Uncle Robert and his family at the Highland Road Cemetery, Southsea. And here's the commemoration to the 3 children who died in infancy on the plinth of the grave. And we thought this was rather funny. Right across the road from the cemetery itself is the grave diggers inn. By necessity a thumbnail sketch, because I've lived in New Zealand since 1959 and I've only got photographs which various members of the family have sent me at Christmas time or after other special events, and photos which I've taken when I've been in England. Michael's story starts when he was born in 1929, when his parents lived in Bellevue Road, Exmouth. Here he can be only a few days old. His parents subsequently moved to Elvis Road, Littleham Cross, Exmouth, where this photograph was taken. Here's my mother, here's Eva's aunt, Emma Rue, Michael's mother, Eva, and Michael when he was about 18 months old. And this was our second Austin 7. group, taken in the garden at Elvis Road, shows Alan with a mourning patch on his arm for the death of Granny Barnes, and my mother with a black-edged cardigan on, Eva, Aunt Emma, and my father. Michael and his parents again moved, this time to number 12 The Beacon, Exmouth, a terraced Georgian house with superb views across the sea to the Haldon Hills. Michael would be about 2 years old here. And at about the same age, Michael visited us at Godalming, and we were taken down to the seaside, and he had a donkey ride. I was about 8 years old, and Michael about 2. Here we are at a farm at East Budley, when Michael was about 4. A big gap then till about 1943, when the Barnes family lived at the Broadway, Littleham Cross, Exmouth, and when Michael was at school at Exeter. He'd be about 12 or 13 here, and he's got Matey, my dog, on his knee. He used to travel by train up and down to Exeter each day, and at one stage he got into great trouble for throwing the railway company's toilet rolls out of the carriage window. The next photo I have is at the time when Michael started his articles with the firm of Orchard & Co., solicitors of Exmouth. It was at about this time, 1947, that Alan was divorced from Eva. Michael's national service was deferred till after he'd qualified as a solicitor, and then he went into the Royal Air Force. After coming out of the RAF, and after a period in Coventry as an assistant solicitor, Mike joined a firm of the solicitors in Barnstaple, and eventually became a partner in Brewer and Barnes. At about this time, Michael and my father are seen in the garden of 2 Fairfield Close, Exmouth, shortly after my mother died in 1953. Alan was married to Laura Chilcott in, I think, 1949, and first Jennifer was born, and then Alison was born, and here is the christening tea at Fairfield Close with Alan, Laura, Alison, Jennifer, my father, myself, and Michael. Michael and I were the rather hopeless godparents when Alison continued to bawl and we didn't know how to stop her crying. Alan and his family now lived at 12 Glenmore Road, Heavitree, Exeter, and here's Alan with Alison when she was a few months old. The next 2 pictures were taken at Fairfield Close. Jennifer was about 4 years old and Alison about a year old. A short time later, Jennifer was myself, and now she had had her hair cut. Here the Barnes girls are growing up. Jen would be about 7 or 8. Alan couldn't resist fooling about at times, and here he's making us believe he's got a fish hook in his behind. In about 1959, here they are on the swing at Glenmore Road, holding Uncle Alan's dog Trixie. Michael and I are in the garden of my father's house at Exvale Road, Countess Weir, just before I sailed to New Zealand for the first time in 1959. In October 1960, Michael was married to Jill Martin, and here are the happy couple. I was back in England in 1961, and I stayed for a week with Mike and Jill at Charnwood in Barnstaple. We went for a picnic one day, and here they are in North Devon. When I was in England in 1961, I also went for a caravan holiday to Widmouth Bay with Alan, Laura, Jen and Ali. And here is Alan fooling about in the morning when he was making an early morning cuppa by putting a tea cosy on his head. And Ali went onto the beach and rode her hobby horse. Charnwood was the first home of Jill and Mike. Here is Jill posed on the stairs there. And here are Mike, Laura, Jill, Jen and Ali in the sitting room at Charnwood. Two pictures at Glenmore Road. Alison at about the same time with the long-suffering Trixie. And Christmas at Glenmore Road in 1960. Emma was born in 1962, and here is my father holding her. And the Barnes family. And then Jeremy was born, and here we have the three generations, Uncle Alan, Michael, and Jeremy. And then, sometime later, in the garden at Charnwood, here we have Jennifer, Michael, Alison, Laura, Emma, and Jill. In about 1967 or 8, the Barnes family moved to Rose Hill, and here is the front of the house. The back of Rose Hill, with its walled garden, the hall and staircase at Rose Hill, Laura and Jill hanging the curtains in the sitting room, and the round sitting room, Ali, Emma, Jennifer, Jill and Laura. And the Barnes family in the garden at Rose Hill. About 1967, Alan found that sadly he could no longer go on fishing because of his arthritic hip. And this was probably the last picture taken of the salmon he caught in the River Exe over many years. 1968 was the year of the next two photos, as Jeremy and Emma were growing up. Christmas 1968. Alan painted Rose Hill for Jill and Michael. To the very end of his days, he never gave up his love of painting. And finally, in this section, in 1971, my brother and sister-in-law, Kevin and Nora Cutler, visited Alan and Laura in Exeter. Here's Alan, Kevin, Laura, Jennifer, Nora. The first of our visits to England came in 1972, and while we were there, we stayed with Jill and Mike at Rose Hill, and the next 4 photographs were taken while we were staying with them. Andrew, nearly 7 years old, had a ride on Emma's horse. This is about the first and last time he's ever been on a horse. Emma, Jay, and Andrew in the sitting room at Rose Hill. An early Christmas tea, because we were leaving for Kenya a week before Christmas. Toby and Alison, unfortunately, are out of the picture, but here we have Michael, Laura, Emma, Jennifer, Jill, Andrew, myself, and Uncle Alan. Here is the studio picture of the Barnes children, which I was given for Christmas. This is the only time that I've ever met Toby, in fact. When we left Rose Hill, we went to stay with Uncle Alan at Glenmore Road, and here he is in the garden there with Jennifer and Alison. The last time I saw Alan Barnes was in December 1972, when he saw myself and Andrew off on the train to London at St David's Station, Exeter. I think it's a remarkable coincidence that the last time I saw my mother alive was when she and my father saw me off on the train to London from St David's Station, Exeter. Now, between 1972 and 1982, I've only got 5 pictures of the Barnes family, and I'll now show you these. Firstly, Alison's wedding to Stephen Hague in Jersey in 1974. Emma, Jay and Toby in 1975 on their ponies at Codden Hill. Jennifer's first wedding to Stephen Clark in 1976. Jen, Laura, Alan. In 1980, Jennifer was married for the second time to Colin Bond. And this is the last picture I have of Alan, taken with Laura in the garden at Glenmore Road in November 1980. From now on, my photographic record of Jill and Mike and their family growing up is very intermittent. And I think there are 2 reasons for this. First of all, as Alan grew older, he got rid of his car, he didn't take as many photographs, and he didn't travel down to Barnstaple as much. Secondly, Emma, Jeremy and Toby were away at boarding school, and perhaps they weren't at Rose Hill when he and Laura visited Jill and Mike. In 1981, Alan died, and with him went my most constant source of photographs to keep me in touch with the family. In 1982, we were in England again, and we visited Jennifer and Colin at their home at Thorburton. Here's Jennifer, Michael, Laura, myself, and Edmund. From Exeter, we went on to see Jill and Mike at Barnstaple. And when in London, we arranged to meet Emma there. Here we are standing outside St Thomas's Hospital, where she was doing her nursing training. The next 2 pictures, taken in 1983 and 1985, show Michael growing up. The first one here taken with Laura in the garden at Glenmore Road. Jen and Michael on holiday in Jersey in 1985. Also in 1985, and on the other side of the world, Jeremy visited us whilst working in New Zealand for 6 months, between leaving Eton and starting his law studies at Oxford Polytechnic. In 1986, we were back in England again, and we saw for the first time Michael's new home at 6 Trafalgar Lawn, Barnstaple. And here we are in the courtyard at Trafalgar Lawn. Later, in 1986, Emma was married to Timothy Traynor. That's another family wedding I've missed. Meanwhile, in Jersey, Alison's family was increasing and growing up. Here we have Jessica and Rebecca. And in 1988, Alison and Jennifer's children got together, the first cousins all growing up. 1989, Alison with Jess and Becky. The second of Jill and Mike's children was wed in 1990. Jeremy married Camilla Vinolis. They looked so happy. The wedding group outside Camilla's home at Tilford near Godalming, Surrey is Jill, Jeremy and Camilla, Michael, Toby, and Camilla's parents. Christmas 1990 in Jersey. Here's Steve with Jess and Becky. We haven't seen Steve since his wedding photo in 1974. So, hello Steve, nice to see you again. And finally, the youngest of the Michael Barnes clan, Emma and Tim's little girls, Charlotte and Georgina. In fact, in 1990, here we have the new generation of Barnes descendants, Alan's great-grandchildren. At the end here, I want to bring the Barnes family history right up to date. So here are a few photographs taken when we were overseas last year. First of all, we visited Emma, Tim and family when we were in Hong Kong, and met William, the new arrival in their family. When staying with Laura at Exeter, we went out to Thorverton to visit Colin and Jennifer. And here we are, just outside their house near the river. Here's Colin and Jennifer's house.
He's always doing something. I think that was one of the first times he really sat down and painted from nature. Because I mean, most of his paintings were sort of things that he copied or from colour photographs or something like that. Oh, he loved it out here.
Whilst in Barnstable, we went for a walk to Baggy Point. There's dear little Pippi. And here we are having tea in the garden at Trafalgar Lawn.
Oh, she said there's Gerald. Hi. Oh, how good it is. Come and see me. She didn't get anything from me. No, that's... No, it was just so funny. You know, we all laughed.
Yeah. It'll take a long time to get finished.
It's probably done.
You are impatient, Mike. When in York, we arranged to meet Toby, who was at Leeds University. I hadn't seen him since 1972 when he was 6 months old. At the end of our stay in England, Andrew joined us at Trafalgar Lawn, and this photo was taken in the courtyard there. And finally, to end the Barnes part of the family history, when in London, we visited Jay and Camilla. They had just moved into their house, and Camilla was expecting Joshua.
I noticed it when I was heading to them. I was looking around for a waste paper bag.
Where's my one?
And I said, this is crazy. There's no waste
not
paper
find
bag.
one.
And then I suddenly clicked. Ah, that's bomb.
It's so infuriating.
Victoria Station had a bomb in a waste paper basket. About 2 years ago. There's not been a waste paper basket seen on a station since then. You're still living in the same place, presumably?
Yeah. Just about being painted again.
Yeah.
It just started on where the study is. Our house.
Starting again.
really like it this time of year.
Moderately cold, isn't it?
Is it?
So it's middle of the winter, really.
Well, the temperatures in the paper have been ranging between 7 and 14. And it's mostly been fine. So it's
This is sort of cool with today's really. Good as it was.
yes. Last year we had an enormous amount of snow.
Right.
And people are coming from Europe now to do their off-season training in New Zealand and finding it very good.
Because where I am, you're about half an hour from the coast and an hour from the ski slopes.
I first saw the light of day on the 27th of July 1923 when I was born at Woking. And we'll start off the history of the Hodges family with a photograph of myself when I was about a year old. Here I am, seated under the cedar tree at Fern Bank. My first memory is of Fern Bank when I was about 4 years old, and I was dressed up to be a flower girl at Uncle Alan's wedding to Eva. My next big milestone was when I started school at the age of 5 at St Hilary's School, Godalming. Here I am, and here's Pam Baker, my great friend. After the death of Granny Barnes and the sale of Fern Bank, we moved in 1932 to Exmouth, Devon, and for 3 years I went to the convent school there. In 1935 I moved on to Southland School, where I remained until I left school in 1940. At this time I used to have dancing lessons with Miss Malcolm, together with a lot of my other friends, and I think I fancied myself then as a sort of future Ginger Rogers. We used to take part in the local pantomime during the Christmas holidays, and it was all great fun. War came in 1939, and when I was 17 and a half years old, I joined the Wrens, and after 2 years, went to the officers' training course at Greenwich Naval College. Here I am. At the end of the OTC course, I was commissioned as a third officer Wrens. I was firstly in the Fleet Air Arm at the fighter training station at Yeovilton, secondly at Milford Haven Naval Base, thirdly at the Midget Submarine Base at Rothsay in Scotland, and lastly the Royal Naval Barracks at Portsmouth. I was demobbed in 1945. In the 8 years between 1945 and 1953, when my mother died, there were really two phases in my life. First of all, there were the 3 years at Pencarrick, when I was helping my parents to reopen it in order to be able for them to sell it, so that they could use the money in their retirement. My father and myself walking along the seafront at Exmouth about 1946. My parents, soon after they retired in 1948. The second phase was from 1948 until 1953, when I went to London University to take my basic academic training to become a dietitian. And then I worked for a period at Westfield College, London, to gain experience. It was during this time that I played a great deal of sport. I played tennis and squash for Devon and won the Devon Women's Squash Championships. And I also played in the London University tennis and was captain of the London University squash team. And then in 1953, I had to give up my job in London when my mother died, and I had to come home to keep house for my father. Here I am in 1951 with the Devon Squash Championship Cup. And the London University ladies tennis team when we played Oxford University at Lady Margaret Hall. Here I am. In 1954, my life dramatically changed course. My father remarried, and I could no longer call his house my home. You could say that for the next 8 years, I was adrift on the wind. In 1954, I went to Leeds Infirmary to take the 18-month course, which I still needed to qualify as a dietitian. And I worked at the General Infirmary until 1959, when I thought it was time for change, and I bought my ticket for New Zealand. I qualified as a dietitian in 1956, and here I'm seen in the diet kitchen at Leeds Infirmary, where I stayed on the staff until 1959, when I took my ticket to New Zealand. 1959, and this picture was taken of me just before I left for New Zealand. I stayed in New Zealand for about 20 months, working in both Christchurch and Auckland, but then I came back to England because my father was in his 70s, and I promised not to be away too long. However, in the 3 months after I returned to England, no suitable jobs came up, but there was one advertised in the English papers as Chief Dietitian at Dunedin Hospital, New Zealand, with fare paid out. And I applied for this, and then I was appointed Deputy Chief Dietitian of Dunedin Hospital, and I sailed again to New Zealand in September 1961. My father and myself on board the Southern Cross at Southampton just before I sailed for New Zealand the second time. This was the last time I ever saw my father. At the end of May 1962, events succeeded each other in a fast and furious manner. I met and became engaged within 6 weeks to Edmund Cutler, a soil scientist working with the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research in Dunedin, and married him within another 6 weeks on the 25th of August 1962. Here we're seen with Rex Stewart, the best man, and Shirley Johnson, my bridesmaid. This is the only photograph I have of myself as the blushing bride. When I was first married, I went on working at Dunedin Hospital, but I resigned before my contract was up. Andrew was born in January 1965. A studio photograph when Andrew was about 8 months old. Andrew about a year old, with the teddy bear that my father had sent him for his first Christmas. We moved to Christchurch in 1967, when Edmund was appointed to the Soil Science Department at Lincoln Agricultural College near Christchurch. Ivy Hall, the oldest building at Lincoln College, and named after the first principal. It has now been made into a magnificent library. Our house in Colwyn Street, where we've lived since coming to Christchurch. Meanwhile, Andrew was growing up, and Edmund continued his teaching at Lincoln College. Andrew about 5 years old when we were on holiday in the Southern Alps. First day at school in 1970. Here's Edmund teaching soils to students on one of the college farms at Lincoln. In 1972, Edmund had six months sabbatical leave, and we came to England and then went on to Kenya and South Africa for 6 weeks. An unusual form of transport in South Africa when I rode an ostrich. life went on in New Zealand, and about 1975, Andrew went to intermediate school. Andrew, taken during his last year at Burnside High School, when he was in the 7th form and the school prefect. Edmund and I have both enjoyed our hobbies over the years, and we thought we'd take you on a quick tour around the house and show you a few things that we've made. Edmund made me this 8-shaft floor loom and a weaving stool, on which I've woven all the rugs that I've made. And this is a fleece rug at the moment, which I'm weaving for the sitting room.
This is a revolving bookcase I made in 1962, just about the time we got married. The wood was collected from sawmills in Southland, and the main structure there you see with the ripple pattern is from Southland Silver Beach, picked up at a sawmill near Tuatapere. This is a closer view of the top of the bookcase, inlaid to a design I made myself with small pieces of wood collected from various places, mainly in Southland, during field trips.
Several years ago, we acquired this very dilapidated Victorian chaise, and Edmund restored the woodwork. We found a retired upholsterer, and he recovered the chaise for us. And at the same time, we bought enough material in order to be able to cover 6 dining room chairs, which Edmund was going to make in the future.
These are 4 of the 6 chairs which go to make up the set around the table. The table itself extends with a leaf put in the middle to take the full set of 6 chairs. Underneath the table is one of Anne's treasured rugs, which she made on another loom I built. This is a closer view of one of the chairs. The wood from which the chairs are made is tawa, sometimes called New Zealand oak. It came from the North Island, and it's a very magnificent wood to work, has a beautiful grain. The upholstery, of course, was done by this professional retired upholsterer. This is the top of the chair from a pattern I made myself and hand carved in our workshop.
I learnt to make Persian-type carpets at the Christchurch Guild of Weavers and Spinners, and this is a traditional Kazakh design. In this wool rug, which is hand-spun and vegetable dyed, I tried to incorporate a Maori design in the middle, which is called a koru, with the natural flowers of New Zealand in the border, which is the red manuka, and the other flowers in the inner border. lace making. I'm making an edging for a mat for my dressing table at the moment. It's torchon lace, which is a French lace. Edmund's made me a lot of my bobbins from native woods. In 1985, Edmund retired from Lincoln, and there were several farewell parties in his honour, and this was taken at one of them. The 25th of August 1986 was our silver wedding day. Edmund's silver wedding present to me was this beautiful Hopi Indian silver bracelet set with turquoise and coral. In 1987, Andrew had got his BA in history, and here he is just before he went off to Wellington to his first job in the government research unit at Parliament. And to bring us up to date, here's Andrew receiving his MA from the Chancellor of Canterbury University in 1989. To bring things right up to date, I'm showing a photo taken when we were staying with Laura and we went down to Budleigh Salterton one afternoon. I'll also show a few video clips when we were staying with her. Finally, an historical record of Pencarrick. This photograph was taken in 1902 when it was a very well-known boys' school. The three masters who owned the school and ran it were Penn, Carr and Wick, and that's how Pencarrick got its name. After we left, Pencarrick was an hotel for several years, and then in the mid-1970s it was demolished. And this is a very sad photograph of my old home. And here we have Pencarrick as it is today, a set of about 20 luxury flats. Littleham Church, where Mummy's funeral was held. And we went and put flowers on Mummy's grave.
Because that one there, it's laid down there. You can try that too, but I mean, you can try that there. Well, you should be enough, shouldn't it? That's where you got.
Here we are at the Countess Weir Garden of Rest, where my father and Uncle Alan's ashes are scattered. And here's Daddy's name in the Book of Remembrance. And this concludes the Barnes family history. We must be greatly indebted to Edmund for his videoing of the history, and I hope you will bear with all our imperfections.